Welcome to the Irish NFL show. It's our week 18 regular season finale game preview and picks show. Right, let's give you a rundown of the numbers. So 4 AFC teams have clinched playoff places already. 6 can still qualify from the AFC depending on the outcome of these games. 5 of the 7 NFC spots have already been clinched. Number 1 seeds, of course, in both conferences already decided. The Ravens in the AFC, 49ers in the NFC. There are 6 other teams fighting for the remaining 2 playoff spots in the NFC. So when you boil all that down, it's commiserations to fans of the other 11 teams, including my Bears and Brian's Giants, who've already been eliminated at this point, and 7 other teams will be joining them on Desolation Road after the weekend's games. No Thursday night football, of course, and no Monday night football. All of those matchups will be decided on Saturday and Sunday. So look, as we prepare to bring the curtain down on the regular season for 23-24 and begin growing our playoff beards, it's important that we'd just like to call out the support that we've had from our partner QuinnBet, including their recent merchandise drop, which has been very gratefully received. You can see Brian rocking his. Still waiting on my delivery from O'Leary Towers to arrive, but no doubt it'll be with me very soon. So the mugs, the hats, the polo shirts, the gilets, all very much appreciated, and they will get plenty of use, I can tell you, including on our upcoming trip to Vegas for Super Bowl 58. So look on with the show and with our first segment of picks and previews, which is brought to you by RuPoints, demonstrating the value of global PR and comms. You can see how RuPoints can help your business at rupoints.com. Brian, it's Steelers at Ravens Saturday at 9:30. A couple of weeks ago, the Steelers look well set up for the playoffs. Then they kind of shot themselves in the foot. Then you were looking at this Ravens game with the way the Ravens have been playing, saying, oof, if the Ravens are still trying to get that number 1 seed, good luck. Now this actually looks like the easiest leg of the accumulator for the Steelers because Ravens are going to rest their players.
Yeah, they've landed on their feet, it's fair to say. Lamar is obviously not going to play, and Huntley is going to step in. I suppose he has similar traits as a quarterback to what we've seen from Lamar, but he like we saw last year, he doesn't run the offense as effectively as Lamar does. Yeah, the Steelers, like, it's one of those teams we've written off so many times, and we joke and we scratch our heads around how they're in this position year after year with Mike Tomlin, such a fantastic head coach, another winning season, and win a season where they've had so much difficulty at the quarterback between Kenny Pickett's poor play, the offensive coordinator being very selective of his play calling, and obviously he was relieved of his duties. You then have Kenny Pickett's injury concerns. It doesn't work with Mitch Trubisky. They land on Rudolph. He gets a bit of a spark. And it all points now towards the Steelers certainly doing their piece. And it kind of reminds me of week 18 last year where they needed the Patriots and the Jets I think it was the Dolphins beat the Jets. That was the game that upset the apple cart. But they got all the results in which they needed. I don't think it's difficult this time around. I think they only need the Bills to lose on Sunday Night Football to the Dolphins for them to be in a position to make the playoffs. I think they'll do their part. I certainly think on Saturday night, nice time for us to watch a game on Saturday even, but how much the Ravens are invested in this game, I don't know. I think they'll play tough for maybe 2.5 quarters because ultimately it's in the AFC North clash and they always play hard, but I think Steelers are fortunate that they've come into this position.
Yeah, when you think the Steelers are 4-point favorites on the road at Baltimore. I don't think anybody's gone into Baltimore and been 4-point favorites so far this season. So that's reflective of the view of resting Lamar and other starters. Not entirely sure who else is not going to suit up for the Ravens in that game. But I mean, the one thing here, Brian, is, and we talked about it before the season started, the Ravens, if they're playing a game of tiddlywinks in the dressing room, they're taking it seriously. Like that's part of their culture. No team had a longer preseason winning streak than the Ravens. Like, one of the things that's gotten them where they are is that there's no such thing as a meaningless game. And if I know the Ravens, I think anyone who's pulling on that uniform to play at the weekend is in no mood to help welcome the Steelers into the playoff picture. Like, they'll want to go out there. They'll be playing for their own places and potentially for playoff time. Like, they'll have pride to play for. Baltimore is a very strong culture. I mean, it's definitely a lot easier for the Steelers than it could have been. I don't think there's any doubt about that. The one concern I'd have from a Pittsburgh perspective, and as you know, you don't take anything that I say about Pittsburgh seriously because I don't seem to be able to get anything right when it comes to them from week to week. It's been an ongoing trope on the Irish NFL show this season. You'd think the Steelers will be one team that I'd actually know a little bit better, but it doesn't seem to be working out that way in terms of my ability to pick their games. But we've seen so many quarterbacks this season, backup quarterbacks and from nowhere quarterbacks, come in, play well for 1 or 2 or 3 games before eventually they revert to the mean. And you wonder after two very good outings, is this the game where Rudolph comes up against that Baltimore defense, as we've seen? They rolled into Santa Clara and did a number on the 49ers. The explosive Dolphins team got absolutely pounded last week. I know not everybody is suiting up for the Ravens, but they know what they're about. McDonald has been touted as one of the outstanding coordinators this season, and somebody who's probably going to be in the mix for a head coaching job in the offseason. Like, none of those guys are taking the night off, right? They're not looking at this going, yeah, we're just playing for the playoffs. And also in the back of my mind, and you mentioned it last week, and I think it was a really good point, is John Harbaugh and the Ravens are semi-haunted by, no matter how much they say they're not, by what happened in 2019 when they clinched the number one seed, when they rested their players, and when they got turned over by the Titans, who went on to the championship game. Like, that's the last thing they want to happen. And, Lamar addressed it during the week. He said, that was my first season as a starter, so things have moved on. We've all learned an awful lot since then. But it's a difficult thing to manage, and we get to the 49ers later. It's not as straightforward as we rest our players, we take the L, it gives us an extra week to prepare and to rest up and for everybody to heal. You can get bushwhacked that way fairly easily, depending on who your opponents are. And we've seen it happen time and time again in the playoffs, where a hungry team that's had to scrap and claw tooth and nail just to get into the playoffs wins on wildcard weekend, comes into your building, and they're ready to rock. And if you're slow to start, you can find yourself behind the chains very, very easily. Which is the long-winded way of saying I do think the Steelers will fulfill their favourites tag. But I'm very interested to see just what kind of Ravens team shows up and how hard they play. I don't think anything's going to be easy for Pittsburgh this weekend, but I think they're good enough to justify their favourites tag.
Just want to make a quick point on this, Conor, and we're going to get into so many games and so many permutations where it's very similar in terms of teams going into these games to play for. I find it very hard to recall a season where all these games went the way of the team who needed to win as opposed to the team who were resting up. There's always one game, no matter how many players are rested. Some team turns up and they go out and they put a beat down. Like, Dar Harbaugh is going to be saying, I'm comfortable with who I'm going to put in here on Saturday. We're at home in this game. We want to fulfill our obligation to the league to go and play this game properly and beat the Steelers. Like, it's not against their own possibility. It's not like this is a Steelers juggernaut team. They've been inconsistent throughout the course of the season. They seem to have got it right over the past 2 weeks. Would it be a surprise once we pick the Steelers and think they'll win? It wouldn't surprise me to see a Ravens team, because last year Huntley has been suggesting as a starter in the league, if he got an opportunity elsewhere, he can come in. We're just saying he's not the quarterback at Lamar's level, but can he come in one game and compete and win a game? I think he can.
Absolutely right. Look, we two teams last year who enhanced their reputation during their unsuccessful playoff runs. Both went one and done in Miami and Baltimore, but both showed up in really tough spots where they were expected to be absolutely beaten out the gate. Bengals were very fortunate to get that goal line stop and the big man pick six going, or no, it was a scoop and score going back the other way in that game. And the Dolphins without Tua showed up very strong in their game against the Bills, and Buffalo were lucky to get out of that one in the end with the win. Like, this Baltimore team, to your point, knows how to play. Their backups are going in there. Like, Tyler Huntley's thinking Lamar Jackson could easily get an injury, God forbid, in the playoffs, and I'm in. So I'm going to use this opportunity to sharpen my own skills and sharpen my own case, because who knows what's going to happen down the road. I'm with you. I think one of these games that's expected to go a certain way isn't going to go that way. I'm reserving my judgment, and we'll come back to that one later on. Don't think it's going to be this one, but I think there's going to be one team that upsets the odds in those supposedly open and shut cases. Texans at Colts is this is a really spicy one for me, Brian. One of the better games on a weekend that's going to be full of absolute chess matches with boxing gloves on. The reverse fixture of this one is the one where Gardner Minshew came into the lineup for the first time for the Colts with Richardson going down. He obviously guided to the Colts to a win in that game. The Texans are about as marginal a favorite as is possible to be. They're favored by 1 point in this one on the road. Bookies, our partner QuinnBet included, find this one almost too close to call. Where do you see it?
I look at the quarterback situation here. I trust more right now, and it's in a roundabout way. It should be Gardner Minshew. He's been in the league quite some time. He's experienced enough. He's been with the Eagles last year, albeit as the backup. He's gone through the playoff marathon in terms of being at a Super Bowl and recognizing the importance of this game. But I was looking at the Texans' victories, and in particular their road victories. Like they've gone on the road this year and won games games at critical times. This is far removed from the week 2 game in which we saw where Richardson, as you touched on, obviously got injured in concussion and Minshew stepped in. I think it's a far cry from that game. I think the Texans last week was a really big game for them. I know they were going up against the Titans team that's coming towards the end of the season, but it was the dominant performance, and it was the Texans of what we saw earlier on the season. The smash mouth football complemented by a really good quarterback, really effective play by the wide receivers, and a defense that's shown its mettle this year under the new coaching scheme. And I look at the Colts defense, and they're being a bit erratic. They've had 2 or 3 games for pick sixes in a row, and then they lay an egg. And once they got over the line last week, I got Aiden, and I touched on it on Monday show. Aiden O'Connell something in the region of 286 yards, and people said he had a poor game. Still, he was still allowed to do that on the Colts defense. I think if the Texans get going, I think it'll be a difficult night for the Colts. And despite the fact they're at home, I'm going to go with the Texans. Both sides 9-7. The winner gets into the playoffs. I think it's going to be the Texans come 4 a.m. that are celebrating.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think one interesting stat that I picked up looking at this game was that the Colts are 6-0 in games where Minshew doesn't throw a pick. Once he turns the ball over, it tends to be a very different picture, and they've lost every single game in which he's thrown an interception, believe it or not. I think one of the things I was waiting to see was how would Stroud be after coming out of the protocol and coming back into the lineup, and would he ball out? He absolutely did, and I'd actually picked the Texans for that game because it seemed what they did at Miami. They didn't look like a team that was heading into a series of meaningless games and was checked out. They looked like they meant business, and I thought they might go in there and look to spoil the Texans' party, but the Texans just weren't allowing that to happen. Again, like we've seen so much from a rookie head coach, a rookie quarterback, and a selection of hopeful draft picks this year in that building is maturity that belies their years and doing things that it normally takes players and teams a couple of years to learn how to do, pulling out tight games, as you say, on the road, coming in and executing fourth quarter comebacks. From a Chicago perspective, that's one of the things that was thrown at Justin Fields for the last 3 years. Well, yeah, however talented he might be, he's tightening up in those fourth quarter spots, and he hasn't been able to lead a fourth quarter comeback until he executed one against Minnesota. CJ Stroud has pretty much nailed every single one that he needed to, and that's what's put them in this position that they've come out of the situations where nobody thought that they would. This, I wouldn't say, is a situation where nobody thinks they can win. As we were saying, there's a sliver of paper between these two teams as you look at it. But I just think the Texans are where they'd want to be in terms of the personnel they got at their disposal. I think they can get to Gardner and cause them a bit of trouble. I like the balance on that Texans offense. And I'm just about favouring them myself. Next one now is the NFC South showdown, Bucs at Panthers. Both of them coming off bad defeats last week. This was a game, Brian, that kind of showed up some of the Baker Mayfield flaws. We've seen so much of good Baker this season. He led them to 4 wins in a row, which has really kind of brought them from obscurity into the playoff picture and potentially winning that division and getting a home game in the playoffs, which you would not have been talking about in at the end of October, start of November. Again, they took a bad beating last week, but it seems inconceivable to me that Tampa rolls into Carolina and loses against the worst team in the league. Like, the Panthers are picking first overall. Well, they're not actually. they're getting the number 1 pick, but they're not going to be picking in the draft for good reason. And if you can't go in and win this game, like, what are you doing at all?
There's a few things that I wanted to throw out in this game. One of which was Kieran Boyle, who obviously is stateside and is involved in the show. He was at the game last weekend. Touched on Monday's show. He said he couldn't get over, and this is not what he was putting out, on the social. It was more about the internal group messages. He said he couldn't get over how much the Panthers were despondent, and like that little jump they had initially after the firing of the head coach in Frank Reich, and then the play for the interim coach. That's all gone away. This team and these players look like a bunch of guys that are just happy for the season to be ended. And from a Bucs perspective, I don't know whether it's accurate to say this, but they struck me last Sunday as a team that knew, no matter what the circumstances of last Sunday's game against the Saints was, they had the opportunity to win the division this weekend against the Panthers. And again, we're talking about teams and that was Steelers landing on their feet. I don't think the Bucs could have asked for a nicer game. But, it was a bit like I was saying
Brian,
last week.
I think that's a really good point. I wonder, was the lack of jeopardy last week for them versus
I think so.
the situation that the Saints had, the thing that actually decided it? The Saints came out and looked like a team that was backed into a corner. And to your point, the Bucs looked like a team that had a second chance and had a kind of golden ticket in their back pocket, or so they felt.
Yeah, the Saints, like even in terms of the pound for pound tackling during the game, and the Bucks have been costly in that because they just didn't look like the same team. And they're nurturing a number of injuries this week, including the quarterback. But Baker Mayfield is obviously going to put himself in a position to play this game. Mike Evans only had three receptions last weekend. Like, he's normally having an average of 7 to 8 per game. He's been getting 2+ touchdowns in a lot of games. Again, totally off. And look, and in saying that, when they finally got their heads together in the fourth quarter, they look like they may have an unlikely comeback, only for Godwin to fumble it when he goes down. Like, this is Bucks all day. It has to be. I mean, as we touched on, we're talking about the Steelers falling on their feet in a roundabout way. Have the Bucks falling on their feet with the situation in Carolina. The Carolina Panthers won, and we touched on it on Monday. They need a strong-minded head coach to win there. So again, it doesn't surprise me today that there's a report out there that Bill Belichick has been highly sought after by a number of NFC South teams this offseason. Obviously, the Panthers very much seem to be in the mix, so maybe that's a conversation for a storyline coming out of this game. But I imagine
I'd love to get the fly in the wall footage when Belichick talks to David Tepper.
Yeah, well, he's feeling the blow of $300K in his back pocket this week with an NFL fine. Look, I think the conversation coming out of this game has to be Bucks victory and potentially who the Panthers are going to go after for their head coach. Bucks all day.
Yeah, $300K. I'd say David Tepper has that behind the couch in his place, to be honest with you, as somebody calculated. He's the wealthiest owner in the NFL. His net worth of $20.6 billion. So $300K is less than 1% of his net worth. So there isn't a violin small enough to commiserate with Tepper on that well-deserved fine. But the Bucks not only have a golden pathway here to the playoffs, Brian, as you've outlined. I'd say a few players are probably feeling chippy. Like the Pro Bowl nominations or the Pro Bowl selections obviously were out today. And if there's one player who was entitled to feel peed off at not being selected, you would think it's Antoine Winfield. Like, for me, he's been one of the outstanding safeties this season. He's really balled out for them. Has been one of the reasons why this veteran defensive core at Tampa has kind of kept them in the fight and put them in the position where they are. So I expect the Bucks to come out of the blocks here and not leave it in any doubt. As you say, Panthers players, pride is an absolutely meaningful motivator. These guys are professional football players. They're not going out to finish the season 2-15 as they now look odds on to do. So, this might be maybe closer than some people expect, because sometimes you get that kind of last sting of a dying wasp effort from a team that's otherwise doomed. But yeah, it's Bucks all day long. It's kind of hard to make the case for Carolina based on everything we've seen this season. They are where they are. That old cliche, you are what your record says you are. They definitely are the worst team in the league, and they've proved it, unfortunately for them, time and time again. Another game that again favors one team, you would think, given where both squads are ahead of it this time of year, is Jaguars at Titans, Brian. The Jags have faltered badly in recent weeks. It looked at one stage like they had a shot at the number 1 seed in the AFC. That's now a very, very distant memory. They're favoured by 5 coming off the beatdown they inflicted on Carolina that we've just been talking about last week. And the Titans, for their part, were humbled by the Texans, another team we've just touched on. They've absolutely nothing to play for, and perhaps some big questions to be asked in Tennessee, and some departures and arrivals anticipated in that part of the world.
Yeah, a heavy line, I thought, 5 points. I know people look at it and say this is a Jags all day game, and maybe the line is kind of reflective of where both teams were last weekend in terms of both. One is a comprehensive win, and one is very dominant in terms of how they were defeated by the Texans. The Titans are an intriguing storyline for me. I did a very good podcast with Noel today, Noel Downing, in which we discussed the top 10 in the draft order, and they're sitting, I think, 7 or 8 at the moment, and we're saying around they've drafted 2 quarterbacks over the past 2 years, and Malik Willis and Will Levis, and you still don't know whether either are the long-term solution. Mike Vrabel looks like he's a bit disgruntled. He was very agitated at his press conference this week in terms of how he said how the team would manage this game. There's nobody cashing in their checks. They're going to play hard and look to win this game. But I think the Jags might be fine in the sense of it's a week off from Trevor Lawrence. He's going to come back this week. Maybe he needed that week. He seems to have been banged up quite a bit. I mean, things haven't been good for the Jags, and they strike me as a team right now that will potentially go into the playoffs, and once they'll have a home game, they might have their season ended quite quickly. Or maybe they'll spring a surprise and get back on track. But I think they'll do enough in this game, but they don't strike me as a team you're going into this weekend. There's other games where you'll say they'll be a comprehensive winner. They'll make sure they're in the playoffs. I think they'll win, get the job done. But I'm not. What's the right word? Enamored by the fact that they're going to win this division. I think there's a lot of problems there.
Yeah, they're a strange team. I think at the start of the season, I would have anticipated that they'd be in a much stronger position than they are. Like the Jags of a couple of weeks ago was kind of what I expected. The Jags of right now is far below, I think, where their ceiling is, where their potential is. And you do kind of have to wonder when a coach as seasoned and as successful and as experienced as Doug Peterson is struggling to get the absolute best out of them. What's going on there? There's so much talent on both sides of the ball. You know, at one stage they were looking like one of the better defensive units. They were leading the league in terms of takeaways. They had, you know, Evan Ingram and other constituents in the passing game balling out. They looked like they had a pretty balanced running game as well. And suddenly it just seem to have stopped clicking. Like it's the antithesis of what happens with a lot of teams where they can struggle to get it together and then suddenly the cogs click into place and they get it going, as the Jaguars did last year. You thought they'd pick up where they left off. If anything, they kind of seem to have had the men in black memory wipe midway through the season, have forgotten how to do it, and they're trying to figure it out again. I think they're still a dangerous team, and they're not necessarily a team that you'd love to face in the playoffs, particularly given what they were able to do when they rallied and beat the Chargers last year in that infamous game from a Brandon Staley perspective. Your man. I think 5 points. I'm not saying this is a rocking chair game, but I can see why they're favoured by 5 in this spot. Given what we saw the Titans do last week, you know, this is from a Steelers perspective, though. This is the kind of banker, isn't it? You kind of this is not the one you're banking on, because they need either the Jags or the Bills to lose, provided they beat the Ravens. You're kind of overlooking this one. I don't think the Titans are the team that's going to spring that we thought they were on the beach shock. I think this is going to be a Jacksonville win. And yeah, I think they probably will. I thought they probably will cover the spread as well. Just given how abject Tennessee were in last week's loss. Sometimes you get a strong fight back game, and I'm sure that's what Mike Vrabel is picking for. But you wonder where his head is at and what his thoughts are going into the off season. You know, he's cut a very disgruntled figure ever since that AJ Brown trade. I think that let the air out of Mike Vrabel's balloon. That was something that he didn't associate with a team that, you know, had designs on actually winning a Super Bowl and thought it was in a good place. I don't think it's ever been the same since then. That to me was the sliding doors moment in Tennessee, and we will watch this space with interest. Over in the NFC South, it's Falcons at Saints. Not surprised that the Saints start this one as favourites at home, Brian, given what we saw happen, you know, to Atlanta last week. One of the strong points for the Falcons in an up and down inconsistent season has been their defense. You know, it's a top 10 defense in most statistical categories. One of the areas where they've been particularly strong is they haven't given up many red zone touchdowns. They've only given up 16 over the entire season. So only 16 times that teams managed to convert red zone opportunities into touchdowns prior to last week's game at Soldier Field. And they gave up 3 in the first half. Like, it really did seem like they'd been figured out and that they couldn't get anything going. You know, Arthur Smith has looked like he's on tilt for the last few weeks. And, you know, again, they're one of those teams that you almost want to back them the week after they lose, because they'll surprise you and come back and win. But rolling into New Orleans, given their inconsistent form and given what the Saints were able to do last week when the chips were down for them, I was impressed by what New Orleans managed to do. I think this is a Saints home win for me.
Yeah, I also felt last week as I feel of a head coach trying to survive this offseason, because there's a lot of talk that changes will be made in New Orleans. But if they can get on a run towards the end of the season, sometimes they can kind of mask what's actually been a poor season. I agree with you. I'll go with the Saints. I was reflecting on the first time in which these played. I was kind of to the narrative you're talking about, that Falcons defense. They held them to 5 field goals, and they had a pick 6 on Derek Carr. Ironically enough, when he was in the red zone, when they looked like the most safest of times for them to score. But I think Arthur Smith is on his last legs there. We've touched on it over the past few weeks. Arthur Blank was quite optimistic about him staying on, and ultimately that Panthers loss at 9-7 on the road was the one that he became unstuck in terms of what the owner was saying about the situation and how he would address it at the end of the season. I think Saints win, and then they'll watch the scores and hopefully the Panthers do them a miracle and beat the Bucs, but I can't see it. So it's the Saints to win, but ultimately lose out on the playoffs.
All right, that brings to an end our first segment of picks, brought to you by RuPoint, demonstrating the value of global PR and comms. You can see how RuPoint can help your business at rupoint.com. Right on we go on the Irish NFL show with our second segment of game picks and previews for week 18, and we're in the AFC North, and this one normally an absolute street fight, Browns at Bengals, but the Browns obviously have nothing to play for here, Brian, because they have already clinched their playoff spot. Their seeding isn't going to change, so their Bengals are actually favoured by 7 points to win this one, which may turn out to be a Pyrrhic victory for them because their playoff fate will be decided elsewhere.
It's just a game that we're suggesting is the team that's with little to play for goes in and wins the game. From a Browns perspective, you would like to think they would see this as keep the momentum going. They've been on such a good run. They've had comeback victories, comprehensive victory last week. They've won in different manners. Like they've had a huge comeback win in Baltimore. Back I think maybe 5 or 6 weeks ago. They've been comprehensive against teams. They've had a comeback win at home against the Bears. They're doing it in all different ways. Would it be against the Rams the possibility they go in and upset the Bengals? But I think ultimately, as you said, nothing's going to change for them no matter what the circumstances of this game. And the reality is they know they're going to play against the AFC South winner, which we touched on there in all likelihood is the Jags. I think to be fully focused on that, there's no need to be risking any players. And we think back to last year and what the Chargers did against the Broncos when they played the wide receivers and got a number of them injured, and then they couldn't play on the road in Jacksonville the following week. Ironically enough, we're talking about the same kind of situation with a team going into Jacksonville. Don't think they make the same mistake. I think the Bengals win. It's one of those dead rubber type of games. I don't think anybody would be too locked in on, apart from people on the fantasy league competitions in their version of the Super Bowl this weekend. It's a Bengals win, but I mean the Browns have bigger things to come and better things over the course of the season.
Yeah, Cincy for me as well, I have to say, for all the reasons you've outlined. When we move on to another game that, again, is another bit of a dead rubber, I'm sure either of these teams would happily take the walkover if it was offered to them game off due to waterlogged pitches, which never happens in the NFL. But Patriots favoured by 2 points at home. I mean, neither of these teams can wait for the season to end.
This is not about the game for me. It's about the story, coming into the game and what happens, the aftermath, and the impact of a result. Because if the Patriots were to win, there's the Cardinals, there's the Giants that can both leapfrog them in terms of the selection order in the draft. And is it Bill Belichick's last game? And Bill Belichick does not like the Jets. Would he want to leave the Patriots with a defeat against the Jets? Will he really care about winning it and upsetting the draft order if he's not going to be there as head coach next season? Jets are on their holidays. Last week's performance, I felt, in Cleveland on the Thursday night kind of proved that defensively they were abject in some of the tackling, in particular Sauce Gardner was getting away from tackles that earlier on the season he would have been going full throttle. I think the Patriots win. I think Bob Kraft won't want the victory because I think he wants to get one of those quarterbacks in the next draft. It may not be Belichick involved in terms of which one they select, but I think come Sunday, Patriots I believe, are favourites by 2 points, which is a fair reflection of where both sides are at. I think the Patriots will finish the season with a home victory.
Yeah, likewise. I don't think there's any reason to dwell too much on this one. Like, Jets very much done. Patriots, given where Belichick's focus has been, there's a huge amount of pride there, and he doesn't tank. He doesn't do that. He's never had to, and it's just not going to be in his nature. You can see him doing the Lovie Smith on it and winning, despite what it does to the draft order, because it's just too much at stake for him in terms of his personal pride, his personal reputation. He's chasing that overall career wins total as well. Like, I wouldn't underestimate that as motivation, given how much we know Belichick reveres the history of the NFL and is steeped in everything that is NFL from way back in the mist of time. NFC North we turn to next, Vikings at Lions, where the Lions are favoured, even though it's essentially a meaningless game for them. It was interesting, though, Brian, to hear Dan Campbell very much throwing out the fighting words and saying he doesn't expect players to take it easy. They're not going to take it easy. They're going to go out to beat the Vikings. Yeah,
well, it's a killer for the Lions, isn't it, really, because of the nature of how that game finished last Saturday night, and then we got into the tribulations and the trials of referees and how the game ends, so we don't need to go there again. But if they had won that game, they would have been in a position to wrap up the 2 seeds, so it's a bit of a killer, and that's so much could change there. They'd have 2 home playoff games this season. I'm going to go Vikings. I think the Lions are saying everything you would expect them to say, but ultimately we know that the Vikings have to win this to maintain their slim chances. I think it's one of those back and forth games. Like, bear in mind when they play each other on Christmas Eve, the Lions won. I think they won by 6 or 7 points in the end. But for 3 quarters, it was a difficult game. They got away from the Vikings in the 4th quarter, only for a brief Vikings comeback. think Kevin O'Connell will need to win this game just to kind of relieve some of the pressure. And there's no pressure on them in a sense, but they need to win to be seen, to be putting themselves in a position to make the playoffs. Ultimately, I think they're going to come up short, but it's a Vikings win on the road.
Yeah, look, I said at the start of the season that the Vikings would miss the playoffs. I saw them backsliding a little bit, and didn't anticipate the quarterback injury, obviously, which, to be fair, has been the main factor in their in their coming off the tracks. They were actually going really, really strongly, and unfortunately for Kirk Cousins, it was looking like being a vintage season for him, and that's now in the realm of what might have been, or in the alternate timeline, what is somewhere else, but. This for me, actually, Brian, I'm going to go against you. Is one of those games where I think the team with nothing to play for is actually going to triumph. The Vikings are just so poor. They really got it handed to them by the Packers last weekend. It's kind of fizzled out there, unfortunately for them. I don't know who's starting a quarterback for them. Is Jaron Hall back in again this weekend? That didn't look like it was going anywhere.
Yeah, it's a bit up and down. They haven't really solidified a decision on that. Yeah, they had to bring Mullins in late on in the game for people who didn't see that Sunday night football game. Comprehensive beaten by the Packers. He has a big job this week to get them up and ready for this.
I suppose what was a surprise there for me as well was the magnitude of victory. I mean, that Packers offense, as we've talked about, and we'll come to them in a moment, it's a very well functioning unit, but you didn't see Brian Flores' defense get handled in that way. That hasn't happened to date. Now, it doesn't help when your offense isn't doing anything for you. This is where complementary football comes to the fore. You got to work together, and they weren't done any favors by what was happening when the Vikings had the ball. From the permutation perspective, the Vikings obviously need this, and they need the Bears to pull off the upset in Lambeau for them to have any chance of qualifying for the playoffs. I don't think, frankly, either of those outcomes are going to happen. It's Lions for me in this one, and we move on to another game in the NFC North, which has now been moved into that late evening window, Brian, which is Bears at Packers. Packers are favourites at home, as you'd expect, given that they've literally owned the Bears, as Aaron Rodgers will tell you, for the last however many years, more years than I care to remember. But it's tighter than maybe you would have thought it would be a few weeks back, as the Bears have kind of narrowed the gap.
Yeah, the Bears have been a great storyline over the course of the last few weeks. Bearing in mind they were 3-8 to be 7-9 and win 4 in the last 5 games. It's a great start. It's been a fantastic start, and it makes for a really mouthwatering off season in the sense of the storylines and the conversations of what they're going to do with the number 1 pick. I know so many Bears fans are still torn as to whether Justin Fields is the answer and whether you pick up the 5th-year option. Ultimately, long term, then you have to pay him in the region of probably 40 million. Is that not going right? If that's what Daniel Jones is able to absorb.
Daniel Jones floor, yep.
That's the floor. That's the reality of NFL quarterbacks. Every 3-4 years, the floor gets higher and higher. And I'm not sure if the Bears are comfortable in doing that. That's why I think it's a great storyline. It's going to be so interesting to see what happens. In this game itself, one of the interesting things for the Packers this season was they've been very poor against teams in the division the first time round. And I know the fact they beat the Bears, but the Bears had opportunities in that game. And against the Lions, they lose the first game. And against the Vikings, they lose the first game. When it's come around again, and I think the defense coordinator, Barry's probably on his final few weeks with the Packers, but he has been able to recognize the flaws of the first game, put it right the second time round. And you look how they were comprehensively good winners on Thanksgiving against the Lions on the road, what they did last weekend against the Packers on the road. And now they're going home. Unfortunately for Bears fans, I don't think it's going to be the same results as what we saw last year in terms of week 18 and one team going in and spoiling the Packers' party. I think the Packers this time around do get it right, and I think they win and put themselves in the playoffs come next weekend.
Yeah, I mean, this obviously for many reasons is an interesting one for me. Even though the Bears in theory have nothing to play for, I wouldn't underestimate how big a motivating factor going into Lambeau and winning in this season and finishing off the season in style is. I mean, people have joked, even Aaron Rodgers made the joke that this is their Super Bowl, but actually from a Chicago perspective, it is. The Bears haven't beaten Green Bay since 2018. This is the most storied rivalry in the NFL in name only. It hasn't been competitive for most of the last 20 years, frankly. Packers are on a 9-game winning streak against the Bears, and most of those games haven't even been remotely competitive, including the one earlier this season. That was a very different Bears team, even though they were playing at home. They went 0-4 before they started showing any sign of life or sense of form. The defense has been completely transformed since Montez Sweat arrived. Interesting to note that 2 Bears defensive players are going to the Pro Bowl this year: Sweat himself and Jalen Johnson. Bears secondary, which we talked about as a strength early on the season, didn't really have any chance to show itself because they just couldn't get any pressure up front. With Sweat coming in now, you really see the value of that linebacker core and TJ Edwards and Tremaine Edmonds, two off-season free agent acquisitions. And, a very talented Bears secondary has actually really started going after turnovers, and they lead now jointly in the league with the 49ers. They've got the same number of takeaways, that they have the league lead there. All of that said, I think the running game could be decisive here. The Packers are 0-4 this season when they give up more than 155 rushing yards. Funnily enough, 105 rushing yards is only slightly ahead of what the Bears' average is. Bears run the ball well. I think the Bears win the game. I'm just so scarred from so many Lambeau Field shellackings, though. I just can't find it in myself, even with the Bears having won 2 games and with all the feel-good factor in Soldier Field and the We Want Fields chant serenading him off the game, and with everything he said. I mean, the Bears are almost cocky going into this game. It's funny listening to the players, and Fields was joking about, kind of lightheartedly slagging off the Packers fans, saying, yeah, we expect them to be loud because there's nothing else to do in Green Bay other than watch football. There's a lot of talk in Chicago, and they want to go and back that up now because Green Bay are well used to they don't fear the Bears at all, and nor should they. They've had no reason to do so. I think it's going to follow that line that we've seen, and Green Bay will notch their 10th consecutive victory against the Bears. But I don't think it's going to be anything like as comprehensive and the 2 possession wins that the Packers have been used to emerging from. And there's been times when they've been able to rest their starters in the fourth quarter. So far have they been ahead. Don't see that happening this weekend. I think it's going to be hard fought, but I think Jordan Love and the Packers will come out the right side of it. He's had a good season this year. They've had a good season, particularly offensively. If you, as you say, and if you had if you had music, you could set this one to a tune. How often have we said that the Packers have been going so well on offense and they've been let down by a defense which actually has a lot of promising pieces in place, but hasn't lived up to its potential. I think this is a game where they're going to come out the right side of it, though.
Well, I just wanted to make a final point on it because, I can't disagree with anything what you said, and I totally understand the narrative as to why the Bears players and fans would be confident going into this game. I don't see this game in any way similar to the first game in terms of how the Bears, struggled in the second half and the Packers pulled away. I think this game is one that's very much in the melting pot come 7 or 8 minutes to go in the fourth quarter. It's one of those who needs it more type scenarios, but it would not be against the realms of possibility if we're looking at. And if you look at where the Bears are to where the Lions were last season, there's so many similarities in how the team have progressed over the course of the season. They had the comment slightly different, but they were unsure whether Goff was going to be the answer there. It looked like initially he was brought in as a kind of interim quarterback to when they got the right one in the draft. Things changed. Things have changed in Chicago dramatically, as you touched on, to see the fans cheering for Justin Fields when there's been so many kind of opposed to him over the course of the last 12 months. It's just, if come 1 o'clock in the morning, I would not be stunned or shocked if the Bears were to win, but I just have a feeling.
No, likewise, I've rarely felt as confident about a Bears team going into Lambeau as I have this time around. I just don't necessarily see them coming out the right side of it. But yeah, like you, I wouldn't be shocked if they did manage to pull it off. Wouldn't be a massive upset again. It's a 3-point game. Chicago are 3-point underdogs going into Lambeau. That's not a mountain to climb by any manner of means, but we shall see. Broncos at Raiders, Brian, another one with not a huge amount at stake unless the Broncos get an absolute cavalcade of other results going their way. There is actually a path to the playoff for Denver, but you'd have it's like the meme of Zach Galifianakis in The Hangover with all the figures coming down in front of his eyes in the casino. It's just not going to happen, is it?
It's over. It's over, unfortunately, for the Broncos. The only thing that Broncos fans will be interested to see is how well Jarrett Stidham plays, and this kind of weird concern around the fact that Russell Wilson is his backup, and if he was to get injured, Russell Wilson would have to step in, and that puts that kind of peace and flux around what he'd have to be paid if he got injured. Look, there's nothing on this game. Do you know what the biggest storyline for me is? Listening to Devontae Adams this week, and he's obviously ringing the bell for a lot of Raiders players. They want Antonio Pierce to be the head coach. They've been scarred before by head coaches that have done really well in the interim phase, and they haven't handed over the reins full time. They've gone off, got another head coach. I think this time the Raiders should put it right and give Antonio Pierce the job. Even in the games in which they've lost, they've been very competitive. Clearly all playing for him. It's an interesting dynamic because of the level of experience he has, but it's also going to be a very different season next year for the Raiders in terms of who they bring in. So some of those Raiders players, whilst they're excited playing from now, the reality is they may not be a Raider come the end of free agency. So that changes things up. I think they should give him the job. I'm still not convinced they will, but in terms of this game, I think the Raiders will win. It probably more signifies where they are at. They need to win it if they want Antonio Pierce to be the head coach.
Yeah, look, I'd agree with that. I don't think there's much in it. I just don't see the Broncos coming out of this one like that. Just everything that's happened makes you wonder about Sean Payton, actually. I mean, he started the season in funny form when he said what he said about Nathaniel Hackett. And, there's an element of karma here, isn't there? Sometimes what you put out does come back to you. And that's kind of happened to Payton this season. I didn't think he'd handle the Russell Wilson situation particularly well and with a huge amount of dignity. Then again, is that a massive surprise given this is Mr. Bountygate? There's a lot of dirty linen in the Payton closet, and we've seen it sometimes the worst of them. We haven't always seen the best of them. That 5-game winning streak, notwithstanding, when the Broncos actually looked like they might do something, that's a distant memory now. At the time being, I think the Mo is with the Raiders at the moment for all the reasons you've outlined. It's been good to see Antonio Pierce get a bit of a shot there and try and salvage something from the wreckage of the Josh McDaniels time, which like the quote from Yoda in Star Wars, not short enough your reign was. Yeah, it's Vegas at home for me there as well, which brings us to the end of our second segment of game previews and picks. Right, we move on to our third segment on the Irish NFL show of the Week 18 games, and we start with Cowboys at Commanders. This is an NFC East clash where the Cowboys are favoured by just under 2 touchdowns, 13-point favourites, Brian. I don't see any reason to doubt that. I think Cowboys have struggled a little bit at times on the road. This is not going to be one of those occasions for me.
No, this is like we're talking about games where there's very little to be said. The Cowboys have got themselves into a great position to go and win the division, be the second seed. They probably are relieved they got over the line last weekend, bearing in mind the nature of that game finished. They're not going to make any mistakes here. And the Commanders don't want to win, let's be honest. Like we can talk about coaching. Like there's 2 storylines this week. One, Ron Rivera looks like he's coaching his last game. And second of all, Eric Bieniemy's already been again suggested as a potential head coach, and he's been linked with Atlanta. He's been linked to the Bears. That's obviously gone now because Eberflus is coming back. And they've got a quarterback, who's not the right, he's not the right guy, unfortunately. It's been an experimental season for Sam Howell. It hasn't really worked out. You could argue the offensive line has been a complete mess, and how could any quarterback function in that situation? But they're picking second in the draft should they lose. Big opportunity with the nature of the quarterbacks coming out. They would be mad to do everything in their power to win this game. But players are players. Who knows? Can't see it. Cowboys.
All right, Seahawks or Cardinals. Seahawks-Steelers last week was to me a bit of a letdown from a Seattle perspective. To me it was a letdown. I'm sure it was a massive letdown to them. I don't know what happened there, because I thought the Seahawks were actually looking like they were getting it back together and looked like making a strong case for playoff contention. They still have a chance here. They're going on the road to Arizona. They are favorites on the road. They're 3-point favorites on the road. And, despite what we saw the Cardinals do to the Eagles last week, which was interesting in and of itself, Seahawks' path involves them winning. They'll also need Green Bay to lose. There's another slightly more convoluted scenario involving ties and Green Bay and New Orleans losses. So the Seahawks don't necessarily have to win this game, but to all intents and purposes, they do. It's set up reasonably well for them, Brian, but the Cardinals and Jonathan Gannon might have something to say about that. They proved a real point last week. I don't know how much of that was just that he was at that extra pitch of intensity, wanted to get one over on Philadelphia because it's his former team, and it's obviously a team that he knows very well, and that knowledge of their defense in particular will really have helped Kyler Murray and the Cardinals offense. But I don't see the Cardinals, like we've talked about it all this season, the Cardinals don't go down without a fight, and if the Seahawks aren't up for it, their playoff hopes, slim and all as they are going to go up in flames.
Yeah, and then an interesting one this week is that the Cardinals have come out and essentially said, now again, I'm conscious it's January. We haven't hit free agency or draft period talk, but they're saying that Kyler Murray will be back as the quarterback next season. And you couldn't argue it, bearing in mind how well he's played since coming back off the injury. And it's just not even the nature of the performance.
It's exactly what you'd say if you were going to trade him as well, right? You don't want to torpedo his value either, so it's always hard to know.
But who's going to take that contract on? Like the contract in which they gave him was mystifying in itself, and no one's going to pick up that contract. It's just, and we've seen what's happened over the course of 2 years with Russell Wilson. I think people will recognise there's quarterbacks out there, and particularly in the draft, that will you get that 5-year plan. But if they do look like a team that's going in the right direction, interesting. If they lose this game, they could flip from 4 down to 7 in terms of the picks. But if they're not going after the quarterback, and they've got 2 first-rounders this year because the Texans obviously moved up last year with Will Anderson, the Cardinals are in a good position. We're asking which game this weekend is the game where the team who needs to win doesn't win. This is the one for me. I think the Cardinals finished the season on a high. I think Kyler Murray was really impressive last week. I think overall he's been impressive since he came back. The Cardinals upset the apple cart, beat the Seahawks in their season.
I thought you were going to go with the Seahawks because I actually was going to pull that one out and say I think the Cardinals are going to upset the odds here as well, and I do think they will. I think the way they played last week, that was no mean feat, right? The Eagles are not where they were, but they're not an easy out at any time, and they had so much to play for, arguably more to play for than the Seahawks do this weekend. Like how much do the Seahawks really believe that they're going to have the opportunity to get that playoff place, given what they're relying on happening in Lambeau and elsewhere, to have the road paved for them? Disappointed with last week. Maybe it's an aberration. Maybe they bounce back and take care of business here this weekend. But I kind of think that the Cardinals are going to close the season out in a high. It looks like there's a bit of a feel-good factor there. They've been there or thereabouts and maybe not got the bounce of the ball in a lot of games. They pulled that one out at the weekend. I think that gives them a lot of confidence heading into this one. I think it's an Arizona win as well, which I didn't think I'd be saying at the start of the predictions. But there you go. You end up in strange places sometimes. Rams of 49ers, Brian. This is, in some ways it shouldn't be a head scratcher, but it kind of is because I'm not entirely sure what Kyle Shanahan is going to do here. The Rams are 4-point underdogs. The 49ers have, however, clinched the number 1 seed, and there's nothing to play for here. But it's, as we were talking about with the Ravens, it's a long time to be idle before you're playing in the playoffs with the bye. If you're sitting starters this week, like you can't see Christian McCaffrey getting next near the turf because a little bit of a calf strain, and it would just be madness to play him. At the same time, does Kyle Shanahan give his starters a bit of game time? Rams can't change their playoff position depending on the result here and some results elsewhere, so that there is an incentive for them. But rolling into Santa Clara when you're not full-blooded going for the win is not an easy proposition. I genuinely I'm kind of torn about this one. I kind of think it's going to be Rams on the road, I have to say, but I don't say that with a massive degree of confidence.
Have we gone against each other in any game so far? And this is an interesting one. This list on Sunday.
I picked the Lions over the Vikings. You picked the Vikings.
Could we have won because I am going with the Rams? It's the Carson Wentz against the Sam Darnold game. Both quarterbacks who obviously have had weird times over the course of the last 2 to 3 years, but like it's all wrapped up for the 49ers. There is absolutely no point in doing anything strenuous or risking any players in this position. This ultimately for me has to be players around who are on the bubble, who are trying to make sure that they get an opportunity to play in the playoffs. The Rams, whilst it looks unlikely, still have a little bit to play for in terms of where they could end up in the position. But the fact that they're not going with Matthew Stafford and other players kind of signifies that they're comfortable where they're at, that they're happy to go on the road into Detroit. And I think the Rams will win. I think it's a case of which of the backups right now I trust to go in. And I think even the 49ers backups will be thinking 2 weeks, 3 weeks ahead in terms of what's ahead, in terms of, the bigger picture.
We saw some of the 49ers backups during their 3-game losing streak, right? We've talked about this again and again, and it's been put it on a t-shirt for Colin throughout the season. 49ers have the best starters in the league. He's put it in bold, he's underlined it, he's put it in italics, point being that there isn't huge amount of depth in that San Francisco squad.
You've also got Rams players that, what did we give the Rams a chance to do? We thought we had like a 5-12 type of season, and all these players, up and coming players, and we spoke when we were doing our NFC West preview around the fact that they had selected so many undrafted rookies, and they were going to run with a lot of these players. And again, there's all these little players that have come in over the course of the season, the Atwells, and these are the players, and obviously Coop. He's going to have these players on Sunday who are coming in again to make a point. I think they win. They played tough against them.
I'm kind of annoyed at how relatively down we were in the Rams heading into the season. I know we'd given the caveat that, you know, if McVay was plugged in, that he's such a good coach and, you know, he knows what he's doing. But like the season they won the Super Bowl, all the focus was on Stafford and on Jalen Ramsey and on OBJ and all the draft capital that they'd given up. But because of the weight of that squad, they had to pick up, you know, guys on a wing and a prayer elsewhere, and they had to fill roster spots with guys that had something to prove, that weren't high draft picks and that weren't big money free agency signings. And they did that. They had a lot of good players show up for them in the course of that Super Bowl run, because they're a well coached team. That they know what they're at. They know how to get the most out of players. So maybe we shouldn't be surprised that they are where they are.
Yeah, but I think a lot of that was down to the fact that we weren't sure where Sean McVay's head was going into the season. There's been the conversation whether he'd walk away, go into the television booth. We quickly realised as the season progressed that he's very much back enjoying being the head coach, enjoying working with these players, and wanted to prove a point for a lot of people, I think, who were kind of writing him off alongside the Rams. And we were talking about coming back to roost in terms of they're struggling now after winning the Super Bowl a couple of years ago. And now people are suggesting they are the dark horse in the playoffs, and the 49ers will not want to play them in an NFC Championship game, or whoever comes up against the Rams will have a difficult game in the playoffs. They're certainly a team to consider, you know, as a sneaky NFC pick, shall we say.
Yeah, indeed. Chiefs at Chargers, next game up. Not a huge amount at stake here, Brian. I'm not really sure what the dominant storyline here is. Obviously, the Chargers, who were actually favoured at home in a long time, probably since they've been 4-point favourites against the Chiefs. They've had that rivalry all going one way for the last few years, and I presume they won't want to pass up the opportunity to bloody the Chiefs' nose, even if it doesn't mean much from a Kansas City perspective. From a Chiefs perspective, though, there must be players there who would look at this as an opportunity to change Andy Reid's thinking, you know, at a time when their offense just hasn't been firing anywhere near as well as, you know, we know it can. You know, it was interesting over the Christmas break. I actually caught up on the couple of episodes of Quarterback, the Netflix show, that I hadn't seen between one thing and another when it was actually out first. And it's just such a contrast where they are this season based on where they finished up last regular season and heading into the playoffs. And it was, you know, all a bullion's mood. They'd locked down the number one seed. You know, they're resting starters in a very different position in that game this time last year. And they were looking forward to, you know, Mahomes was talking about how they maybe matched up better against the Bills, but he wanted the Bengals in the divisional round because they had something to prove. And, you know, they ended up, they did manage to prove that and go on to the Super Bowl. But it's a very different picture this time around. I'm actually edging it towards the Chiefs, I have to say. I think they might upset the odds in this one, just purely because I really don't fancy the Chargers, and I've never had much joy picking them this season. So, kind of to spite myself, I'm going with Kansas City in this one.
I think the biggest storyline for this one is how quickly the Chargers season can be over, and how quickly the NCAA championship game is over, and they can get Jim Harbaugh in for an immediate interview and put JH and JH together for next season. It's a nothing game. Andy Reid has recognised that nothing can happen this weekend that's going to improve. Their situation in the playoffs, and it's recognised by the fact of how many players he's resting, not just Patrick Mahomes, but essentially the vast majority of the offense. I'll lean Chargers. I think Chargers might win it. It's one of those games. It's a toss-up, and when there's nothing to play, it's very much who wants to make a point. I think, I recognise that the Chiefs will want to win because they still probably feel they need to get things right after the last few weeks, but I think the Chargers will come fourth quarter. I think the Chiefs will be easing off. The Chargers will win it close.
Eagles at Giants, Brian. It's not so long since we were looking at the Eagles' remaining schedule with 4 games left after they went through their miserable run of games against the heavyweights in both conferences, and saying, yeah, but they've got 2 games against the Giants. They've got the Cardinals. Those are 3 games that they'd be, from their perspective, banking on as wins. It has not worked out that way. The Eagles would not have been expected, and they wouldn't have expected themselves to be still needing this win just to clinch the division. Their playoff place is obviously secure, but this was the game where they were supposed to be wrapping up the number 1 seed, even if they even needed it. It's gone in a very different direction for them. They're now coming off, you know, what from their point of view would have been an embarrassing defeat to the Cardinals. They roll into MetLife with the Giants. All right, doesn't do their draft prospects any favors, but bit of an opportunity to bloody their rivals' noses here.
Yeah, and just to jump back, because we never really did a piece after, we didn't anyway. I know Shane and Colin had caught up and did like a Stephen's Day special, but that particular game on Christmas Day, I mean, there was a lot of opportunities for the Giants to win that game. There was that big drive by the Eagles that kind of got it back on the straight and narrow, but there was no Eagle fans coming out of that game. The nature of how it ended with the Giants trying to score late on to tie the game up were comfortable. They won the game. People thought, okay, fine, they're finishing the season with a nice run. And what came to pass last week was essentially what we've been saying for weeks. They've been getting away with it, but ultimately at the end, it's going to come crashing down. We thought it'd be playoff time when it'll come crashing down, but it came crashing down a lot sooner than we thought in terms of they're now a wildcard team should the Cowboys win. One of the interesting nuggets from Sirianni's press conference was if they're made aware that the Cowboys are winning comprehensively in Washington, he will start taking players out immediately. So it wouldn't come as a surprise to me to see second half, you've got Mariota in as quarterback, the main wide receivers out of the game, and potentially offensive line out of the game because they're going to be aware that they're going to go and play the NFC South the following week. That spells danger for me from a Giants perspective. Giants fans recognise once it would be nice to beat the Eagles. The best thing, say, for the Giants this weekend would be to lose the game and check the scores to see if they've moved up the ladder. I think the Giants will win. I think it's going to be because of the nature of the Cowboys being so comprehensive. I think the Eagles will ease off the gas, and I think the Giants should have beaten the Rams last weekend. I think the Giants will play hard and beat the Eagles this weekend.
Yeah, the Eagles have been such a disappointment over the last few weeks, and really on the season as a whole. Like, they weren't a convincing 10-1, which sounds like a bizarre thing to say, but as you just mentioned there were so many games where they got away with it. A couple against the Commanders in particular that come to mind that I remember spending a lot of time talking about at the time, where they just never seemed to be able to pull away and do the things that they were able to do last year, and there's a lot of reasons for that. Watching them in particular in the red zone over the last couple of weeks, like, there's no faith in them being able to execute anything other than the brotherly shove. If they're in anything other than 3rd and 1 or 4th and 1, you're just not convinced that they're going to get it done. Devontae Smith is obviously injured as well. They just don't seem to have gotten anything like the level of consistency and performance out of some of their offensive playmakers that they did last year. They've had a couple of injuries and that slowed them down. Defensively, they've been a real disappointment. We've talked about their almost non-existent linebacker core, how their secondary has been picked apart. Pass rush hasn't been anywhere near the way it was. They're not scaring teams. They're not an intimidating prospect in the way that they were. How many column inches were written about the strength in the trenches and how they were the template for how a modern NFL team should be built. If ever there was a team that you would have thought would be in a strong position to run it back, it would be them. And look, they're still going to the playoffs one way or the other. So to your point, it's a question of only whether they get a home game on wildcard weekend or whether they're going on the road as a wildcard team on wildcard weekend. This is a game that I think, though, that they'll have to focus on as a get right game, because there's no time left. This is money time. If there's a chance that, as you say, the Cowboys aren't running away with that game in Washington, you'd expect the Eagles to come to play, and Sirianni says he'll pull the starters fine, but I just think it's not in the Giants' interest to put up too much of a fight, to your point, and teams have a funny way of getting what they want when draft picture is, or draft order is really at stake, and with the honourable or dishonourable exception, depending on which way you look at it from either an ownership or a fan perspective, of Lovie Smith's infamous win on the final day of last season with the Houston Texans. I don't see Brian Daboll and the Giants letting that happen, because it's not in their interest for it to happen. I think ultimately Philadelphia will come out with the win.
Just one final point. I agree with everything you're saying, and which is why normally I'd be saying this is a shoe-in Eagles victory. But I do think the Cowboys will be comprehensively up by halftime. I think they could be 2 or 3 scores up, and I think that's why I believe the Giants will win, because I do think the Eagles will ease off. And you're right when we're saying Brian Daboll will recognise, or Joe Shane, the GM, will recognise what the most important thing is. But Brian Daboll doesn't strike me as a head coach he is concerned about the situation thereafter. I think they'll deal with what they have to deal with come February and come March around where they're selecting. I think ultimately, judging by the nature of his press conference yesterday and how he was after the game on Sunday, clearly very disappointed they didn't beat the Rams. He's a fighter and he comes out to win. He doesn't care about what the circumstances. And I think he needs a victory against one of these teams. If you look at the record in which he's had, in a strange way, he's had a good season, but yeah, it's been a disappointing season. Yeah. He kind of steadied his ship. And people recognize now he is the right head coach to be there. his record against the Cowboys and Eagles is really poor. He hasn't won any game against them over the course of the season. That's 5 games if you include the playoff game last year. But the nature of the performances, they've been comprehensively beaten. In a roundabout way, he needs to beat one of them. And whilst it's a meaningless game, people will say, why did you go and win this game? I think for him, from his perspective, he needs to get a win against one of the bigger teams in the division.
Yeah, makes sense. We'll see how it shakes out. I'm sticking with the Eagles. Right, Bills at Dolphins is the final game. What a game to finish on. Probably on balance the showpiece game of the weekend. Brian, the reverse fixture, the Bills put an absolute beatdown on the Dolphins. It was remarkable to see the turnaround from the 70-20 Miami win over Denver to the Bills putting 48 in them and beating them 48-20 in a game that, unfortunately, from Ken Dorsey's perspective, didn't save his bacon as offensive coordinator. He later became the scapegoat for the perceived sputtering on Buffalo's offense. And it's been a little bit up and down for Buffalo since. However, with perhaps the exception of last weekend's effort against the Patriots, where you either see that as an outlier or maybe a worrying sign that the Bills aren't quite right. It's been a different picture. I think the victory over the Cowboys really a statement win from a Buffalo perspective. They absolutely need this in Miami. The Bills' playoff scenario here is they can win the division and have a home game on wildcard weekend, or they may end up out of the playoffs altogether, depending on results elsewhere. As we talked about earlier, the Steelers are relying on the Dolphins to win this one. That's not necessarily a safe bet, considering what happened to the Dolphins last weekend, though. How do you see this one?
I said on the show the other day was that the Bills have been on a great run, and I know Colin bought into this steam train of Josh Allen, and once he gets going, it's hard to stop it. But I haven't been convinced over the course of the last 2 weeks. Got away with it in SoFi against a struggling Chargers team, and if it wasn't for better quarterback play, they would have been beaten last weekend against the Patriots. And here we are now. In fairness, the Dolphins have been so up and down. I think for me, and depending on availability within the Dolphins, if the Dolphins get a huge chunk of the players back, in particular if they get Waddle back and offensive line is put back together, I think the Dolphins will be able to put up points on this Bills defense. I think the Dolphins will. It feels like a bit of a shootout game. It feels like, and who's going to have the ball last will win the game. But I think the Dolphins, I wouldn't get away from the fact that the Dolphins will be ruining a really heavy defeat last weekend, having gone into Baltimore. And similarities to how it was when they went into Buffalo, went toe for toe for 2 quarters and then ultimately got blown out. I think this weekend, Sunday Night Football, people suggest that the Dolphins can't beat big teams. I think this is going to be a game in which they put that right. I'm going to go with the Dolphins to win the division, remain in the 2nd seed, and end the Bills' season.
All right. Well, if we were disappointed with the level of groupthink so far, Brian, I'm going to delight you by going exactly the opposite direction. I think if you look at the defeats that the Dolphins have taken this season, they've been physically overpowered by the Titans. They were physically overpowered by the Ravens, and this has been a classic Miami failing, to coin the old 1970s English Football League manager routine. They don't like it's up them, the Dolphins. They really haven't shown up in those spots. I think, Bradley Chubb is a huge loss. And I think last weekend's game, as I hinted at when I was teeing it up there, was the exception that proves the rule. I just think Buffalo struggle against the Patriots for whatever reason. It's slightly in Sean McDermott's head, bar that one dominant playoff victory that they had, which was obviously a huge one a couple of years ago. They've always been uncomfortably close to New England, even when New England hasn't been in a great spot since the Tom Brady era came to an end. They've very much a different record against the Dolphins, though. The Dolphins are 1-10 against the Bills in the Josh Allen era. They've never really gotten to grips with him. I don't think they're in a good place to get to grips with him this weekend. Buffalo just has too much to play for. And we talked about them being, again, prior to the New England game, the team nobody wants to play in the playoffs in the AFC. I still think that's the case. And they still have a chance to win the division here. Despite everything that they've had in a rocky season, I still think this is a really strong team. I think you average out where they've been over the last couple of years. We've talked about it time and time again. They're consistently one of the best teams in the league. I think we've kind of slightly forgotten about that and slightly slept on them. Perhaps you'd say with good reason, given some of their results. But they're coming right. They're coming good at just the right time. I think this is a Buffalo win on the road.
I think this one might come down to more so the coaching. aspect in terms of how each coach goes against each other. We've talked about during the season. Colin's been a bit critical of Sean McDermott at key moments, and in particular the game up in Philly, and then I think it was the week after that when he was not kind of managing the game properly. It'd be interesting to see if it's a tight game in the fourth quarter, how both head coaches can react to that situation. Makes for a great game. It's a shame in a way it's on Sunday Night Football because there'll be a lot of fans. There might be the Harden fans who will stay up for it, but there'll be a lot of people who will be reviewing the action on Monday morning as opposed to really enjoying, which should be a great end to, I think it's the 272nd regular season game. It makes for a great game. Probably you can understand why it's been flexed out to Sunday night.
Yeah, just before we wrapped up, Brian, like as you say, 272 regular season games we'll have down and under our belts by the end of the weekend. Reflecting, instant take at this stage on the regular season that's been, I have to say personally, it's been one of the more entertaining ones for me. Obviously, it's the first one that I've been involved with the show, so that adds an extra frisson to your enjoyment of the game, certainly. But we've had so many weeks where you've just had consistently good games. It's been very difficult, and we know this from being held to account for our picks every week. It's been very difficult sometimes to discern the trends, and we've seen teams bubble up and then go right back down. We've seen other teams emerge from nowhere. We've seen coaching changes dramatically affect the trajectory of some teams. We saw it a little bit with the Broncos. We saw it with the Raiders, as we talked about. We've seen teams come sneaky good down the stretch. I'm really looking forward to the playoffs, I have to say, and I'm really looking forward to this week 18 games, given everything we've seen.
Yeah, it feels like that crowded house song. Was it 4 seasons in one day? Because I think over the course of the season, we have put teams up there only for them to be knocked down. There was the Buffalo Bills experience earlier in the season that quickly kind of, filtered away. It's come back again.
Well, it was the Dolphins before the Bills. Then it was the 49ers.
Yeah, and then of course the Eagles were 11-0. Let's not forget, we at one stage we were suggesting they could only end the season with 1 or 2 defeats. They ended up with 5. So would it be against the realms of possibility we get a surprise in the playoffs? Certainly not. I think whilst the 2 standout teams have been the Ravens and 49ers, we have seen trends in the past where the number 1 seeds don't necessarily end up playing each other in the Super Bowl. Even 2 years ago, the Bengals, I believe, were the 5th seed. Interestingly enough, one piece which is broken in the last 10 minutes is that Dalvin Cook has signed for the Ravens in the last 10 minutes. It's been announced he was released by the Jets yesterday. Give himself an opportunity. I kind of dislike these players who tend not to put it in over the course of the season. They get released and get the opportunity to then play in the playoffs. It's like as if they don't put the effort in, they get released, and then they find themselves a way of maneuvering a deal to be in the playoffs. It'd be interesting to see. I think, again, the Ravens are recognizing they have a huge opportunity, and they want to make sure. You've touched on it rightly last week in terms of the injuries in which they've had, in particular Mitchell, the rookie running back, but they're stocking up now, essentially.
Of course, yeah.
We saw it with the Rams with Odell Beckham. The Ravens obviously recognize big opportunity, get an extra body in, an experienced running back. Could be the difference. Could be the difference when a player goes down that they can call upon him, who on his day is a great running back.
Yeah, how many times have we seen it? As you say, it's that one acquisition just at the end of the season that helps turn the tide for you, whether it be Von Miller and OBJ or others. We've seen it plenty of times where a guy joins the right team at just the right time. You'd certainly argue from what we've seen over the last couple of weeks, the Ravens are the team that you'd want to be, whose bandwagon you'd want to be jumping on. But yeah, look, that's a really interesting nugget. I'm very interested to see how that's going to bear out for the Ravens in the playoffs. But we'll get over the weekend's games first before we start talking about that. By the time we come back this time next week, we'll know exactly what the playoff picture is, and we'll be immersing ourselves in the real permutations and combinations and addressing who's going to get to Super Bowl 58 in Las Vegas.
Yeah, we're going nowhere. Still lots to go. Still a lot of action, a lot of games, and a lot of podcasts. Thanks to Rory for the nice comments. Obviously, he's really enjoying the content in which we're putting out over the course of the season. But ultimately, it's all about, like, we do this for our own enjoyment, our own passion for the game. But it's great to see people recognizing the work and loving the show and loving the podcast as well.
Yeah, big time. And look, I think we're all looking forward as well to the growth of the game in Ireland. And, it's been fantastic this season to see, the Steelers activating and doing, their first ever watch party here, and the kicking competition and the other engagement that they've had. And, having a team attached to the Irish market for the first time. And obviously the Jaguars have taken on the Irish market as well. It's building the momentum towards getting a game here. And it's one thing for us to be talking about the games from afar. It'd be another thing entirely to be looking forward to a game in Ireland, which, hopefully is going to happen sooner rather than later.
Yeah, we'll be back on Monday. We'll still be without Colin, but we'll be back, and Colin is due back for a show next week. But yeah, looking forward to reviewing the last weekend of the regular season with yourself.
Living it up in Minnesota, he is. Check Colum's Instagram there. You'll have all the weird and wonderful details of the Mall of America, the Liquid Death drink, and everything else. If you want to keep up with his adventures, we wish him well. We look forward to welcoming him back because we can slag him in person.